water, or the current, or even the darkness between the mangrove roots. It's the silence. Along the Segama River, in the far reaches of Sabah, people claim that when it approaches, the dogs stop barking. Not out of fear, but as if something deeper in the forest is warning them to stay quiet. And after the heavy rains, when the river swells and the mud loosens, the old families whisper that this is when the giant moves upstream, closer to the villages, closer than anyone realizes. This is the river where Japanese soldiers once wrote, in the margins of their wartime diaries, about a dark shape rising at dusk, longer than any crocodile they had seen, and wide enough to disturb the water without a splash. They didn't give it a name. The locals eventually did. Father of the Devil. Tonight, we follow the stories that refuse to fade. A canoe that vanished without a ripple, a slide mark wider than a car, water rising without the wind, and a final account from a forestry worker who heard something scrape against a steel pontoon in the dead of night. A sound no one on this river has ever been able to explain. We saved that one for the end. Stay with me. To understand the legend, you have to understand the river. The Segama is not a place of clear water or open sight lines. It bends like a slow-moving animal through sulfur-colored mud, shifting depth without warning, its banks collapsing and reforming with every monsoon. Beneath the surface, visibility drops to almost nothing. Even a flashlight becomes a dull, shapeless glow. Here, anything, from a drifting log to a living shadow, can pass right beneath you without ever being seen. The forest presses close against the water, its roots tangled like old ropes. Every sound echoes differently. A splash might come from 20 meters away, or from directly beneath your boat. And the people who live along these banks, they don't describe the Segama as a river. They describe it as a boundary, a place where the forest ends and something older begins. Saltwater crocodiles thrive here, one of the few places in Borneo where they still move with complete freedom. They use the flooded forests as hunting corridors, traveling silently under the cover of silt and shadow. Researchers have tagged individuals in neighboring regions, documenting their ability to move upriver for astonishing distances. A large male can vanish for weeks, then reappear 50 kilometers away, which means a creature, even larger than what we expect, could slip through this system without leaving much behind, except disturbed mud and unanswered questions. Here, the water tells only half the story, and the other half, the part people whisper, is what we're about to follow. Before we follow the stories, we need to understand the creature at the heart of them. The saltwater crocodile, Crocodilus porosus, is the largest living reptile on Earth. Documented individuals in Borneo routinely surpass 5 meters, and older males can become territorial enough to dominate entire stretches of river. They grow slowly, but they never stop growing. A crocodile that survives long enough, through storms, droughts, and human expansion, can reach a size that surprises even researchers. In 2011, biologists working in Sabah tagged a massive male with a radio transmitter. It moved astonishing distances, slipping between river systems as if the landscape were a single connected body, which raises a question scientists still debate. How many large crocodiles go unrecorded simply because no one ever sees them clearly? In muddy water, a 6-meter crocodile looks identical to something larger, except for the pressure wave it creates beneath a boat, and the way the water rises before it breaks the surface. And the Segama River has hundreds of places where a creature, any creature, could live for decades, rarely seen, barely measured, and easily mistaken for something far bigger. The science doesn't confirm a giant, but it doesn't rule one out either. Not here. Not in a river this deep, this old, and this unwilling to give up its secrets. The name didn't come from science, and it didn't come from soldiers. It came from the river communities themselves. When elders were asked why they feared this crocodile more than others, they didn't describe its teeth or its color. They described its presence. They said ordinary crocodiles take animals. This one takes certainty. It appears when the water is deepest, when the rain erases tracks, and when even experienced hunters hesitate to stand near the bank. As for its size, no one ever measured it. There were no tapes, no scales, no photographs taken at the right moment. But when those accounts are placed side by side, a pattern begins to form, not in meters, but in comparison. They spoke of a body longer than any crocodile known to science, wide enough to lift the river without splashing, heavy enough to leave marks that vanished by morning. If those accounts are even partly accurate, this animal would fall somewhere between 26 and 32 feet in length, a size no modern crocodile has ever been proven to reach. They called it Father of the Devil, not because it was evil, but because, in their words, even the river's darker spirits seemed to move aside when it passed. When you start asking about the Segama River, one thing becomes clear almost immediately. There are far more sightings than anyone can fit into a single episode. Stories from fishermen, loggers, river guides, and families who have lived along these banks for generations. Some of them contradict each other, some sound impossible, and some repeat the same details from people who have never met. Tonight, we focus on only a handful, the ones mentioned again and again. The first has become part of local instinct. When the dogs go silent, they say, "Don't stand near the water." Ordinary crocodiles make them bark, but when the big one moves, the village dogs fall still, ears lowered, tails tight, as if they sense a pressure in the air humans cannot feel. Then there are the fishermen who describe their boats slowing suddenly in calm water, as though something vast and heavy passed beneath them without breaking the surface. Others talk about fish leaping toward the shore, not away from the boat, but away from something behind them. And from time to time, someone mentions the river rising for just a moment, forming a gentle bulge with no wind, no current, and no boat to explain it. These are only fragments, a few pieces pulled from dozens of accounts. Enough to see a pattern, but not enough to understand it. Not yet. Because the stories that come next are older, heavier, and harder to dismiss. Before we move deeper into the legend, there's a chapter that rarely appears in official reports. A chapter people speak of quietly, only when the river is calm enough to listen. The stories of those who never came back. There are more of these accounts than anyone can truly count, scattered across decades, told by families who never met, all echoing the same unsettling pattern. One tale speaks of a night fisherman who went to check his nets at dusk. By morning, his canoe was found drifting upside down, unbroken, untouched, as if set gently aside by something that didn't need to struggle for him. Another story tells of a hunter who vanished near a flooded bend. All they found were deep drag marks cut sharply into the mud, and no tracks leading back out. And among older families, there is the wartime rumor. A soldier who went to the river alone and never returned. His disappearance mentioned only in the same hushed tone as the shadow his patrol wrote about days earlier. No one could ever point to a single animal behind them. The river left no tracks, no bite marks, no explanations. Only the same quiet question. What was moving through the water when these people vanished? Along the Segama, rain is more than weather. It is a signal. When the monsoon sweeps through and the river swells into the forest, locals say the creature moves differently, with purpose, with intention, as if the rising water is an invitation. After heavy rain, the elders warn, stay inland. That's when it travels. Flooded channels become silent corridors. The currents flatten. Tree roots disappear under brown water, turning the forest into a maze that only something born of this river knows how to navigate. And that is when the sightings spike. Villagers report seeing long ripples moving against the flow, boats rocking gently though no wind touches them, a shadow slipping across submerged ground that had been dry the day before. Some say the giant follows the deeper water, using the flood to cross areas it can't reach in the dry season. Others believe the rain wakes it, stirring something ancient that rests beneath the mud. Whatever the reason, the pattern is always the same. Stillness, rain, silence, movement. And in those hours after the storm, people keep their distance from the banks. Because if the stories are true, the giant is closer then than at any other time. In the late 1970s, logging roads began to push deeper into the forests around the Segama. With them came teams of workers, men who knew the river, the mud, and the animals that lived there. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, a crew found something along a remote riverbank that none of them could explain. A slide mark, deep, wide, pressed into the mud with a weight that felt impossible. They had seen crocodile trails before. They knew the width of the belly, the drag of the tail, the smooth imprint left by a large male. But this was different. The mark stretched across the bank like the path of a moving boulder, as if something enormous had pulled itself out of the water, rested for a moment, then slipped back in. One worker measured the width by pacing it out with his boots. Later, he told his supervisor the same thing he told his family for years afterward. It was wider than a car. When they returned the next day to take a closer look, the mark was gone, washed smooth by the rising tide. No photos, no plaster cast, nothing but the memory of men who had no reason to invent a story, and every reason to stay away from that bend of the river after dark. Stories of missing livestock aren't unusual along wide Asian rivers, but one account from a small settlement near the middle reaches of the Segama still circulates among the older families. It happened on a quiet night after several days of storms. A water buffalo, a large, stubborn animal weighing nearly half a ton, had been tied near the bank to graze on the fresh grass that grows after heavy rain. By morning, it was gone. 2 furrows were found in the mud, deep, parallel tracks, as if something had dragged the animal sideways into the river. Not pulled from the front, not lifted, dragged. Whatever made those marks didn't thrash or struggle. It moved with the calm, steady pressure of something that knew nothing on that riverbank could stop it. Some villagers said it was a crocodile. Others refused to guess. But the story persists for one reason. No one ever heard a sound. And on the Segama, silence is rarely a good sign. Before we move further downstream, there's one earlier chapter I want to return to. Not because it explains everything, but because without it, the picture never quite fits together. It's easy to miss, and almost did in this story. So stay with me, this part matters. One repeated entry has unsettled historians and locals alike. Kagewa Nagai. The shadow is long. They wrote about something rising at dusk, a dark mass near the river bend, broader than a pontoon, and moving with a steadiness no one could explain. One soldier described it as a shape that lifted the water without breaking it. Another wrote in a hurried hand that the river felt watched whenever the shadow surfaced. But in one torn fragment found decades later in a family archive, a single phrase appears, scratched into the page as if the writer regretted it the moment the ink dried. It follows the deep water. After that entry, there were no further notes from that particular patrol. Whether they left, relocated, or simply stopped writing, no one knows. But the locals remember the place where those soldiers refused to set camp after sunset. And today, it's the same river bend where many of the modern sightings begin. When a story persists for decades, across villages, across generations, across people who never met, over the years, researchers, fishermen, and wildlife officers have offered their own theories about the creatures said to move through the Segama. The first is simple: a very old saltwater crocodile, larger than average, territorial, and rarely seen in full. A crocodile that survives long enough can reach sizes that defy expectations, especially in deep, food-rich rivers. Another theory is that multiple crocodiles have been mistaken for one. A series of large males, each encountered at different times, their stories blending together into a single legend. There is also the idea that flood seasons distort perception. High water, floating debris, and poor visibility can make even ordinary animals seem extraordinary. And then there are the theories that live closer to the edge of folklore. Some locals believe the creature is a river spirit that takes the form of a crocodile only when the water is deep enough. Others say it is a survivor, older than the roads, the plantations, even older than the soldiers who once feared the river at dusk. One belief, repeated again and again, is that whatever this thing is, it doesn't behave like other crocodiles. It moves without splashing, it rises without sound, and it appears only when the river chooses. The truth may be simpler, or more complicated, or lost somewhere in the mud and the memory of those who witnessed it. But one story, the one we saved for last, has lingered longer than most. A story from a forestry worker who heard something that should not have been possible on a quiet night, far from any village. And it begins with a steel pontoon anchored to the riverbank. It happened in the mid-1990s, long after the slide mark, long after most of the sightings had faded into local whispers. A forestry worker, a man who had spent half his life on the river, was stationed overnight at a remote logging site several hours upstream. He slept on a steel pontoon anchored to the bank, a floating platform used to load timber during the day. The river was calm, no wind, no current strong enough to shift the platform. Sometime after midnight, he woke to a sound, a faint metallic vibration, as if something heavy had brushed the underside of the pontoon. Not a splash, not a bump from debris, a scrape. He sat up, listening. Another scrape, longer this time, traveling from one side of the platform to the other. At first he thought it might be a floating log, but logs don't move upward. They don't lift against metal, and they don't follow the hull from bow to stern with slow, deliberate pressure. The pontoon shifted, just slightly, just enough for him to feel it. Something massive was beneath him. He grabbed his flashlight and aimed it at the water. All he saw was a faint bulge in the surface, a rise that moved without forming a wave, as if the river itself was swelling around something too large to hide and too quiet to reveal. Then came the final sound, the single heavy impact against the steel. The worker froze. He said later that it felt like standing on a drum while someone tapped the underside. Someone with the strength to dent the metal if they wanted to. And the river, as always, kept whatever passed beneath him for itself. He refused to sleep on the water again, and he never returned to that stretch of the river. Legends don't last because they're loud. They last because they echo quietly through the places we rarely look. In the mud, in the water, in the words passed down when the fire burns low. The Segama River has carried many stories, too many for one episode, too many for one voice. But each account, from fishermen, from families, from soldiers far from home, adds another layer to a creature that may or may not exist in the way the stories describe. Yet something is there, something that moves in silence, rises without a splash, and follows the deep water long after the storms. If you've heard similar stories, or if there's a creature from your region that deserves a closer look, share it in the comments. Your words guide where these stories go next. Thank you for watching. More stories are on the way from the forgotten corners of the earth. Your comments and your curiosity are what keep these legends alive. So don't forget to share your thoughts below and join the channel if you haven't already. Every voice helps this community grow, and you are the reason this channel exists. Stay curious and stay safe.